Androgyny, Mimesis, and the marriage of the boy heroine on the English Renaissance stage. Recent literary historians have pointed out that the English Renaissance theatre was an important site of cultural transformation, a place where cultural change was not simply reflected, but also rehearsed and enacted. Greenblatt, Moretti, Montrose. Thus, it is instructive to examine theatrical representations of gender during that period, for the theatre provided an arena where changing gender definitions could be displayed, deplored, or enforced, and where anxieties about them could be expressed by playwrights and incited or repressed among their audiences. The English Renaissance stage is an especially interesting subject for gender studies because women's parts were played by boys. As the term gender roles indicates, there is an important sense in which gender is a kind of act for all women, not only for actresses, and not only for boys pretending to be women. Sandra Gilbert, for instance, points out that among modern writers, the women, in contrast to the men, perceive the fundamental sexual self as a kind of costume rather than as the naked bedrock reality it seems to their male contemporaries. On a stage where female characters were always played by male actors, feminine gender was inevitably a matter of costume, and in plays where the heroines dressed as boys, gender became doubly problematic, the unstable product of role-playing and costume, not only in the theatrical representation, but also within the fiction presented on stage. For a Renaissance audience, the sexual ambiguity of the boy heroine in masculine attire was likely to invoke a widespread and ambivalent mythological tradition centering on the figure of the androgyne. The androgyne could be an image of transcendence, of surpassing the bounds that limit the human condition in a fallen world, of breaking through the constraints that material existence imposes on spiritual aspiration, or the personal restrictions that define our roles in society. But the androgyne could also be an object of ridicule, or an image of monstrous deformity, of social and physical abnormality. Both these images of the androgyne appear in the plays of Shakespeare and his contemporaries, expressing radically different conceptions of human life and society, and of dramatic imitation as well. The idealized image of the androgyne, supported by Neoplatonic, alchemical, and biblical traditions, appeared frequently in the literature of the 16th century. Increasingly, however, the high Renaissance image of the androgyne as a symbol of prelapsarian, or mystical perfection, was replaced by the satirical portrait of the hermaphrodite, a medical monstrosity, or social misfit, an image of perversion or abnormality. The spiritualized conception of the supernatural androgyne gave way to a more limited version, confined within the social and natural worlds of ordinary life, which produced the image of the unnatural hermaphrodite. At the same time, literary theory increasingly subordinated art to nature. Nature became the object of artistic imitation and the standard by which art was to be judged. 1. These changing conceptions of gender, androgyny, and theatrical mimesis can be seen in the representations of transvestite heroines in 5 English Renaissance comedies. John Lyly's Galatea, circa 1587, William Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, circa 1596, As You Like It, 1599, and Twelfth Night, circa 1601, and Ben Jonson's Epicene, 1609. Although the 5 plays cover a span of only 22 years, they are well qualified to exhibit a changing theatrical tradition. Lyly, writing in the 1580s for Queen Elizabeth's court, was the most influential comic playwright of his age. And of all his plays, Galatea seems to have exerted the greatest influence on Shakespeare. He is also the only comic dramatist mentioned in Jonson's tribute to Shakespeare in the first folio. Jonson, in turn, did more than any other Elizabethan playwright to influence the drama of his successors. John Dryden considered him the most learned and judicious writer which any theatre ever had, and singled out Epicene as a model for the writers of his own age. The 5 plays are also well qualified to display changing conceptions of gender. In each of them, the plot centers on marriage, the paradigm that governed the lives and defined the identities of Renaissance women. As the Laws, Resolutions of Women's Rights, 1632, proclaimed, all women are understood either married or to be married. But the institution of marriage was changing profoundly, and the Renaissance redefinition of marriage necessarily entailed a redefinition of the feminine. The archetypal relationship between men and women, marriage is also an archetypal symbol for the relations between contrasted sets of gender attributes. Thus, what the marriages express is not only their authors and audiences' changing visions of what is desirable and undesirable in relationships between persons of different sex, but also, and perhaps more important, their changing gender definitions and changing visions of the relations between masculine and feminine gender attributes within an individual human psyche and within the culture that shapes it. Various conceptions of these relations can be seen in the changing figure of the boy heroine, who occupies a central position in all 5 plays. In each one, the bride-to-be wears a transvestite disguise, and in each, the disguise plays a crucial role in the plot, impeding, enabling, or even motivating the marriage. In Galatea, the earliest of the plays, the 2 heroines, disguised as boys, fall in love with each other. When their true sex is revealed, the possibility of their marriage seems to be precluded, but at the end of the play the gods intervene, and we learn that the problem will be resolved by a kind of celestial sex change operation. At the time of the marriage, one of the girls will be changed into a boy. We are not told, and the girls do not care which one. By contrast, in Epicene, the latest of the 5 plays, there are no gods, there is no heroine, and marriage represents not the object of the desired resolution, but the chief obstacle to its achievement. Epicene is a boy disguised as a girl and married to Montrose. The play ends happily with the dissolution of the marriage when Epicene is revealed as a boy. The hero, Dauphine, has arranged the deception so that he can secure his rightful inheritance by thwarting Monrose's plan to marry and beget another heir. The Galatea and Epicene represent opposite extremes. Although money is a central issue in Epicene, in Galatea it is important only in the realistic comic subplot, where Rafe, Robin, and Dick, 3 impoverished boys, seek their fortunes in various dubious trades. Mercenary concerns have no impact on the marriage of Lyly's heroines. One girl's father states that he wishes to keep his daughter a girl in order to preserve his son's inheritance intact, but no one pays any attention to his wishes. In Epicene, the claims of inheritance are opposed throughout to a character's wish to marry, and here it is Dauphine's desire to secure his inheritance, a desire the audience is made to share, that prevails. There is a close connection in these plays between the value assigned to androgyny and the value assigned to marriage. Galatea ends in a validation of both, Epicene in a repudiation of both. Sexual identity is an obstacle to marriage in both plays, but in Galatea it proves infinitely malleable in the hands of the gods and irrelevant in the eyes of the audience, since we neither know nor care which girl will become a boy, while in Epicene it becomes the decisive factor in determining the outcome of the plot. No androgyne and no heroine, Epicene, the silent woman of Jonson's subtitle, is simply a pretty boy in female disguise, a pawn in Dauphine's economic game, with no stake in the outcome of the plot and no will or character of his own. The androgynous characters who do appear in the play, the mannish collegiate ladies and their effeminate male consorts, are minor characters conceived in purely satiric terms, present only to be mocked and abhorred by their fellow characters, their playwright, and their audience. In their differing treatments of androgyny, Lyly and Jonson make strikingly different statements not only about gender, but also about the relation between the play world and the real world. Gender is above all a social construct, arbitrary and varying from one society to another, related to sex but not identical with it. And gender roles vary from one culture to another, just as the words we use to signify our meanings vary from one language community to another. Moreover, the relations between gender and sex are as various and problematic as those between signifying words and signified meanings, or between poetic fictions and the elusive realities they imitate. Just as different cultures and even different individuals within a single culture can construe all those relations differently, so too the relation between gender and sex can be construed in a variety of ways. Thus, in Epicene, where reality is social, gender is an ineluctable reality. Instead of celebrating androgyny, the play indulges in homophobic satire, and sex roles are rigidly enforced. In contrast to Jonson's realistic social satire, set in a recognizable contemporary London, Lyly's fantasy, set in a Never Never land where Greek gods can appear on the banks of the Humber, uses liberal doses of myth and magic, and celebrates androgyny. For the girls and the gods in Galatea, gender is arbitrary, unreal, and reversible, because the vantage point transcends the social to include the realm of fantastic imagination and spirit, where androgyny is an image of human self-completion rather than an aberrant social category. The three Shakespearean plays, written after Lyly's and before Jonson's, are more ambivalent in their treatment of monetary considerations, the value of romantic love, and the significance of gender identity. Shakespeare celebrates romantic love, but he also satirizes it, in Silvius and Phoebe, in Orsino, in Olivia, and even in Orlando and Rosalind. And although money and status are never the primary issues for his protagonists, they are never wholly discounted. Portia, like a princess in a fairy tale, will be won only by the suitor who can answer the fantastic riddle of the caskets, but the first thing we hear about her is that she is a lady richly left. And if Bassanio ends like a romantic hero, he begins very much like a fortune hunter. Orlando and Rosalind fall in love at first sight, but their wedding is crowned not only by the miraculous appearance of Hymen, but also by the revelation that Rosalind's father has recovered his dukedom. Olivia is beautiful, and she inspires Orsino's romantic love, but she is also a rich heiress, the object of Malvolio's dreams of social and economic advancement. Most important for my purposes, unlike either Lyly or Jonson, Shakespeare refuses to dissolve the difference between the sex of the boy actor and that of the heroine he plays, and he uses his boy heroine's sexual ambiguity not only to complicate his plots, but also to resolve them. Portia's masculine disguise enables her to save Antonio, but her female reality, which enables her to love and marry Bassanio, is what motivates her to do it in the first place. By playing the boy's part of Ganymede, Rosalind enables Silvius to marry Phoebe. By playing the girl's part of Rosalind, she enables Orlando to marry herself. These heroines' transvestite disguises are neither fully repudiated, as in Epicene, nor fully authenticated, as in Galatea. Instead, they become provisionally real, as, for instance, in Twelfth Night. Viola's disguise as the boy Cesario is both repudiated when she marries Orsino, and authenticated when her twin brother Sebastian marries Olivia. Like Lyly, Shakespeare ends these comedies in the marriages of his boy heroines, but his conclusions vindicate the reality principle as well as the power of love and illusion. If Lyly and Jonson represent opposite extremes, Shakespeare occupies an ambiguous middle ground between them. 2. Even after such a cursory description of these 5 plays, an obvious question arises. What are we to make of the differences in their treatments of androgynous figures? Perhaps still more pressing for those of us who are primarily interested in Shakespeare's representations of women is the curious fact that his festive comedies celebrate heroines who are clearly the dominant figures in their worlds, while his later plays depict heroines who are either weaker or less sympathetic, and, although still played by boy actors, almost never dressed in boys' clothing. Moreover, it is in Jonson's play, the latest of the 5, that women are most powerless and most subject to misogynist satire. Various explanations suggest themselves. Perhaps the passing of the English throne from a powerful and beloved queen to a misogynist king influenced the entire climate of English opinion regarding women, or at least the tastes of London's theatre-going public. Perhaps the shift from public to private theatres was responsible. As Alfred Harbridge points out, the misogynist picture of women and the debased view of marriage that emerge from the plays written for the private theatres differ markedly from the more enlightened view that prevails in the public theatre plays. Still, even Harbridge's distinction between the two audiences has been questioned. Moreover, Lyly was writing for Queen Elizabeth's court, and the misogyny of a writer like Jonson seems to persist whether he is writing for the public or the private theatre. Indeed, it is evident even in his private conversation. The issue of the changing positions of women in Renaissance England has been much debated in recent years. Was humanist education a force for women's liberation, or did it inculcate docility and obedience? Was the presence of a powerful female ruler a spur to feminism, Or was Elizabeth the proverbial token woman who reinforces patriarchal restraints on the rest of her sex, kind of like Margaret Thatcher? Does the Ich Mulier controversy of the early 17th century point to a widespread female practice of transvestism and a growing assertiveness among women? Does it betoken an intensified enforcement of patriarchal restrictions, or is it simply an expression of a general uneasiness about increased social mobility and disorder? Did the rising middle class elevate the status of women, or did feminism do better in an aristocratic society with a solid royalist regime? Did Protestantism and Puritanism, with their new conceptions of marriage, undermine the old Pauline orthodoxies about women and provide for a significant advance in women's status during the late 16th and early 17th centuries? Or did the Reformation actually remove some of the possibilities for women's independent thought and action? And the Puritan conception of marriage actually lead to greater patriarchy in husband-wife relations, a decline in the status and legal rights of wives, and the increased subordination of women within an increasingly sanctified and nuclear family structure? Although different writers, examining similar evidence, come to opposite conclusions, the preponderance of evidence suggests that in most ways the position of women declined during the Renaissance. The reasons for that decline are complicated and still somewhat obscure. Its course is uneven and difficult to chart, but a variety of indicators suggest a loss of status and opportunity for women in virtually every area of English life. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, the humanist tradition of female learning was already fading, the learned woman a subject for ridicule. During the late 16th and the 17th centuries, English women were increasingly excluded from work they had earlier performed, removed from participation in economic, political, and cultural life, relegated to a marginal and dependent economic status, excluded from the public arenas of political power and cultural authority, and confined within the rising barriers that marked off the home as a separate private sphere. The plays I have chosen to discuss delineate a similar pattern of decline. It would, of course, be a mistake to attempt to make simple equations between the boy heroines in these 5 plays and the real women who watched them in Renaissance audiences. All 5 heroines are the creations of men. Not only the playwrights who wrote their parts, but also the actors who played them were male. Moreover, the relation between actual life and theatrical representation is inherently complicated and problematic, a dialectical process that inevitably involves anxiety, compensation, and wish fulfillment rather than simple mimetic reproduction. Male writers in every period have managed to celebrate feminine projections of their own ideals while maintaining misogynist attitudes and practices in their responses to actual women. In this case, the relation between reality and representation is particularly complicated because, as I hope to show, the issue of gender is intimately connected, in the drama of the English Renaissance, to the issue of theatrical representation itself. 3. The theatre of a world in transition, the English Renaissance stage offered a field of contention for competing ideologies. The changing conceptions of gender and theatrical mimesis it displayed were intimately related to the changing conceptions of language, nature, and human society produced by the emergent discursive field that was to shape the age to come. The ascendancy of a literalist copy theory of language that sought to tighten the relation between word and thing had obvious affinities with the tightening of the sex-gender relation. Moreover, feminist historians of science have shown how the new science, rejecting the ancient ideal of nature as a nurturing mother, and the traditional alchemical metaphors of erotic union and androgynous perfection, played an important part in the reification and polarization of gender definitions and the devaluation of the feminine at the beginning of the modern age. An analogous process can be traced in the English drama of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, where changing conceptions of the dramatist's art are related to increasingly rigid and degraded conceptions of gender and femininity. In delineating a variety of relations between the sex of the actor and that of the character he plays, these playwrights express varying assumptions about the relation between art and life, which is analogous in all these plays to relations between sex and gender. The Androgyny, in fact, becomes the fullest expression of both relations. Thus, in Jonson's play, which subscribes to the neoclassical ideal of art as an imitation of life. Gender also imitates life, both in a limited, literal sense, since the sex of Epicene is finally revealed as male, the sex of the actor who played the part, and in a broader sense, since women in the play are subjected to the same calumny, stereotyping, and social restrictions that real women suffered in Jonson's world. For Lyly and for Shakespeare, the relation between art and life is complementary as well as reflective. That is, it resembles the relation between two complementary angles, one growing as the other decreases. What is real in one world becomes unreal in the other. What is impossible in one world becomes possible in the other. And the work of the world of art is not only to imitate the defects of the real world, but also to supply what is wanting. Thus, in these plays, the true gender of the transvestite figure turns out to be feminine, the opposite of the real sex of the boy who played her part. Similarly, the dynamics of the plots make femininity a desideratum rather than the liability it was in actual life. And within the represented action, female characters exercise power, even though the boy actors who played them were either apprentices, the lowliest members of an adult company, or subjected to the miserable conditions of a children's company. The best example of the relation I am calling complementary is the characterization of Portia in Merchant of Venice. The chief inhabitant of the fantastic world of Belmont, Portia is introduced to the audience as a kind of mythical fairy tale princess. In Belmont is a lady richly left, and she is fair, and fairer than that word, of wondrous virtues. Nor is the wide world ignorant of her worth. For the four winds blow in from every coast renowned suitors, and her sunny locks hang on her temples like a golden fleece, which makes her seat of Belmont Colchis' strond, and many Jasons come in quest of her. And one of the first things we hear Portia say is the curious disclaimer she makes when she tells her waiting woman, "You will come into the court, and swear that I have a poor pennyworth in the English." She speaks the lines, of course, in English, on an English stage, but they seem calculated not only to indicate that Portia is an Italian lady, the inhabitant of a remote and exotic country, but also to remind the audience that their world and their language are different from hers. Shakespeare's allusion to the tacit stage convention that allows almost all his characters, even his ancient Romans, to speak beautiful English invokes and insists on the difference between the world represented on stage and the world inhabited by the audience, between the rich and powerful Italian lady and the poor and powerless English boy who played her part. The same difference is invoked when Portia leaves her fantastic realm of Belmont to enter the more prosaic and contemporary world of Venice, which, although Italian, is still part of the literal geography of the 16th century, a world where trials take place in law courts rather than in the form of a fairy tale contest in which suitors from many countries attempt to win a rich and beautiful wife by solving the riddles of the caskets. When Portia moves from Belmont to Venice, she takes on the disguise of a boy, dressing in garments of the same gender that the real boy who played her part would have worn when he stepped outside the theatre. What is important, I think, is that this is a false appearance. The reality within the play, the reality that Portia is a woman, can be seen only in the fantastic world of Belmont, a world that is not a reflection, but a reversal of the world the play's audience actually inhabited. In Belmont, the boy actor takes on a false gender that belies his true sex to depict the truth about the character he plays. The Elizabethan platitude about poets and playwrights holding mirrors up to nature is more complicated and problematic than it seems. A mirror image always reverses the reality it reflects. The complementary relation to nature and society that I have ascribed to dramatic fantasy can be figured by the yin-yang diagram that symbolizes the relation of male to female. The fantastic dramatic complement playing the part of the female principal, the reality it complements playing the part of the male. The association is most apparent in fantastic plays because they flaunt their artificiality, but it can be said to characterize dramatic representation per se. In an androcentric culture, the female principal is negative, like the blank space that defines a positive pictorial image, or like the concept of feminine gender that allows the male to define itself as masculine. it is also supplementary, like the artistic imitation that represents natural life. Fantastic drama reverses this equation, locating the reality principle within the world of art rather than outside it, creating an anti-world where object becomes subject, and the feminine can be characterized as real. Realistic art, by contrast, strives to replicate within itself the hierarchical relations that its society has defined as natural. Thus, it is not surprising that Jonson's realistic dramatic technique is often praised for its virility, or that his play ends by banishing the feminine principle, or that Lyly's fantasy can make a marriage between two characters who started out as girls. Close analogies can be drawn between changing conceptions of gender and androgyny, and changes in mimetic theory and practice. Neoplatonic tradition idealized the androgyne and exalted the feminine, stressing the spirituality of woman and her close link with the mysteries. It also provided the basis for the Renaissance literary theory that described poetic fictions as idealized visions of supernatural perfection, transcending the limitations of ordinary life and nature. This conception of poetry can be found in Sir Philip Sidney's description of the poet making things either better than nature bringeth forth, or, quite anew, forms such as never were in nature. Nature never set forth the earth in so rich tapestry as diverse poets have done. Her world is brazen, the poets only deliver a golden. The golden world is a focus for nostalgia. Sidney associates it with prelapsarian nature, and Shakespeare associates it with a romanticized version of the feudal past. Portia's Belmont, Duke Senior's Forest Court, and Illyria are places where wealth comes by inheritance and social status through kinship, a system that some feminist historians would argue was in fact more hospitable to women than the one that was replacing it in Shakespeare's time. By contrast, Venice is a world of commodity and trade, and the bonds of kinship are disrupted in both households in Act 1 of As You Like It. The same contrast can be seen in Galatea, where the comic subplot anticipates Jonson's contemporary characters and settings, his satiric treatment of alchemy, and his emphasis on the harsh economic realities of a changing world. Rafe, Robin, and Dick search for masters and go hungry in a recognizable 16th century Lincolnshire, where the woods are being cut down to make ships, while Galatea and Phillida exist on another plane entirely, idealized, mythological, and ahistorical. The inhabitants of the Golden World are not realistic contemporary portraits. Instead, they are images of ideal types. Sidney's Neoplatonic poet painteth not Lucretia, whom he never saw, but painteth the outward beauty of such a virtue. In creating characters, the poet does not imitate what hath been or shall be, but considers what may be or should be. Nature never brought forth so true a lover as Theagenes, so constant a friend as Pylades, so valiant a man as Orlando, so right a prince as Xenophon's Cyrus, so excellent a man every way as Virgil's Aeneas. The poet, inspired with the force of a divine breath, bringeth things forth far surpassing nature's doings, to depict images of the perfection that disappeared from the world with that first accursed fall of Adam. The androgyne, also associated in Neoplatonic tradition with an ideal perfection lost at the time of the fall, is exactly the sort of subject Sidney envisions here. The association of the androgyne with magic, prevalent in primitive cultures as well as in Renaissance tradition, is echoed by Lyly's magical transformations, and also by the hint of magic associated with Shakespeare's Rosalind, who claims to have conversed with a magician from the age of 3, and who comes on stage to her marriage accompanied by the god Hymen. The association of androgyny with alchemy, and both with dramatic fantasy, is not directly expressed in these plays, but Lyly's subplot, which anticipates Jonson's satire on alchemy as a hoax, also anticipates his rejection of androgyny and his realistic subject matter. The boys in Lyly's subplot, contemporary English types, never lose their social or sexual identities, and at the end of the play their problems are resolved when they are invited to sing at Galatea and Phillida's wedding, invited, that is, to become the boy choristers their actors really were. His fantastic main plot, by contrast, celebrates androgyny and relies for its resolution on the power of magic transformations. Sidney distinguishes poetry from every other form of discourse by its maker's refusal to be bound by the limitations of nature. Only the poet, disdaining to be tied to any such subjection, lifted up with the vigour of his own invention, doth grow in effect another nature. For Jonson, by contrast, although poets may invent, feign, and devise many things, they must accommodate all they invent to the use and service of nature. The true artificer will not run away from nature, as he were afraid of her, or depart from life and the likeness of truth. Rejecting the extravagant fantasies of his predecessors and contemporaries, and anticipating the taste of the age to come, Jonson's prefatory letter to The Alchemist warns his readers, "Thou wert never more fair in the way to be cozened than in this age, in poetry, especially in plays, wherein to run away from nature and be afraid of her is the only point of art that tickles the spectators." Jonson's Alchemist can, in fact, be read as an extended metaphor condemning fantastic playwrights who transgress the rule of nature and the hierarchical order of human society. Poets who attempt to improve on nature are no better than the cozening alchemists who pretend to transmute base metals into gold and poor persons into rich. Sir Epicure Mammon sounds, in Subtle's description, very much like Sidney's poet of the Golden World. He will make nature ashamed of her long sleep, when art, who's but a stepdame, shall do more than she in her best love to mankind ever could. If his dream last, he'll turn the age to gold. With the philosopher's stone and the wealth it will bring, Mammon plans to make an old man of 80 a child, and transform his cook into a knight. Reminded that the fulfillment of his extravagant desires will not be tolerated in a monarchy, being a wealth unfit for any private subject, he proposes to move to a free state. Jonson's satire in The Alchemist associates the subversive power of alchemy with the power of new money to undermine the established social and political order, and his letter to the reader points up an additional association with the subversive power of theatrical representation. The actor, no less than the alchemist, transgresses the social and ontological categories that keep the world an orderly place. Taking on a variety of roles, an actor belies his own identity. Theatrical impersonation transforms the poor into the rich, the commoner into the king, the old into the young, the male into the female. In his analogy between fantastic playwrights and cozening alchemists, Jonson attempts to deal with the antisocial aspects of theatrical representation by relegating them to the rejected category of dramatic fantasy. Renaissance writers took various positions on fantasy and on the theatre itself. Some praised the actors for their protean ability to assume disparate shapes, while others condemned them as hypocrites who belied the natures and roles that God had seen fit to give them. But admirers and detractors alike understood that the player was a dangerous anomaly in a hierarchical society, a creator of anti-structures that, like the inversions of carnival, could undermine as well as reinforce existing social hierarchies. In his condemnation of false artificers who run away from nature, and in his satire of mannish women who transgress their gender roles, Jonson attempts to contain this subversive potential by drawing sharp distinctions between legitimate and illegitimate uses of dramatic representation, and subjects his art to the laws of nature and society. True art, for Jonson, is conservative, offering a rule and pattern of living well, and disposing us to all civil offices of society. The issue of gender role transgression is intimately related, not only in Jonson, but in other Elizabethan discussions of the theatre, to the issue of theatrical representation. The negative association that I am suggesting, the pejorative analogy between the boy actor's sexual ambiguity and the ambiguity of dramatic mirroring, is a familiar feature of Puritan diatribes against the stage. Typically, the argument begins by echoing the Platonic charge that poets misrepresent the world they imitate, but it almost invariably ends by citing the scriptural injunctions against transvestism. Deuteronomy 22:5. As Rabbi Zeal of the Land Busy tells the puppets in Jonson's Bartholomew Fair, "My main argument against you is that you are an abomination, for the male among you putteth on the apparel of the female, and the female of the male." The prescription, of course, involved sexual as well as social and political anxieties. As Lisa Jardine points out, the incitement to homosexual lust with which the Puritans charged the pretty boy actresses wearing female clothes may have been more than a matter of overheated Puritan imagination. In his homophobic satire in Epicene, Jonson foregrounds the social dimension of the prohibition. He characterizes the mannish collegiates as unnatural, but chiefly because they violate the hierarchical divisions between the sexes that should prevail in society. But the sexual dimension is also present, for instance, in Truewitt's scornful description of Claremont melting away his time between his mistress abroad and his angle at home. Shakespeare, by contrast, emphasizes the attractiveness of his transvestite heroines to other women as well as to the men they love. And Lyly's transvestite heroines are depicted as more beautiful and more worthy than Hebe, a character named for Jove's female cupbearer, who was replaced after she fell and exposed her private parts by Ganymede, the archetypal catamite, whose name Shakespeare's Rosalind will take to go with her transvestite disguise. In Epicene, Jonson attempts to deal with the dangers of social and sexual transgression by upholding the socially sanctioned gender divisions and by resolving his play in the abolition of sexual ambiguity. The transvestite figure is finally revealed as the boy the actor who played him really was. In Bartholomew Fair, Jonson uses another strategy. There, the puppet, Dionysius, named for the androgynous god in whose festivals the Greek drama originated, confutes the Puritan by lifting up its garment to show that the puppets, like souls redeemed in Christ, have neither male nor female amongst us. Human actors have sexual bodies, but the characters they play are whatever sex, the playwright asserts. By making his actor a sexless puppet, Jonson avoids the dangerous duplicity between sex and gender embodied in the figure of the boy actress. Shakespeare, by contrast, insists on this duplicity, most notably in As You Like It, where he uses a complicated layering on of disguise to render Rosalind's sexual identity thoroughly ambivalent. Played by a boy actor, Rosalind is a female character who disguises herself as a boy, and then, wearing that masculine disguise, play-acts the part of her own female self. And the ambiguities of the conclusion to that play involve not only gender, but sex itself, and not only the character Rosalind, but also the boy actor who played her part. In the epilogue, that ambivalent figure refuses to choose between actor and character, or between male and female, but instead insists on the ambiguities. Within the same short speech, she is both the Lady Rosalind, when she says, "It is not the fashion to see the lady," the epilogue, and the boy who played Rosalind's part, when he promises, "If I were a woman, I would kiss as many of you as had beards that pleased me, complexions that liked me, and breaths that I defied not." 4. The epilogue to As You Like It associates Rosalind's sexual ambiguity with the complicated relations between the male actor and the female character he portrays, the dramatic representation and the reality it imitates, the play and the audience that watches it. Rosalind, or the boy who plays her part, insists that the audience must cooperate if the play is to work. "I charge you, O women, for the love you bear to men, to like as much of this play as please you. And I charge you, O men, for the love you bear to women, as I perceive by your simpering, none of you hates them, that between you and the women the play may please." The epilogue's suggestive reference to a sexual transaction between the men and women in Shakespeare's audience echoes the multiple marriages that have been depicted on stage, and also implies that the relation between the play and its audience is a kind of sexual transaction or marriage. To be successful, the play must win both sexes with a playful androgynous appeal that is most appropriately expressed by the ambiguous figure who no longer has a single name or sexual identity, combining in one nature Rosalind, Ganymede, and the boy who played their parts. The relationship Rosalind proposes between Shakespeare's play and its audience is significantly different from the relationships between play and audience contemplated in Galatea and in Epicene. Written for boys to perform at Queen Elizabeth's court, Galatea addressed an audience for whom, as for the gods within the play, all things were possible, and for whom life, like the play itself, was a kind of elaborate artificial spectacle. Epicene was written for boys to perform in a private theatre before an audience for whom the very act of attending the play was an assertion of social status. In both cases, the actors and the audience constituted two homogeneous groups, the boys performing on stage clearly inferior to the adults who watched them. Shakespeare's plays, by contrast, were written for an adult company to perform for a mixed audience. The leading actors were shareholders in the company, entrepreneurs rather than unpaid workers for a master, and their heterogeneous audience would include people whose social rank and economic power were less than their own. In the first two situations, the reality of the audience dominates that of the actors. One of Lyly's girls becomes a man in order to marry the other, and Jonson's boy is revealed as a boy so that a marriage can be annulled and an inheritance ensured. But despite these differences, there are important similarities. Both plays resolve the tensions between real sex and illusory gender, and both resolutions privilege the sex that wielded authority in the play's audience. Designed to please a female monarch who wielded patriarchal authority, Galatea looks beyond the end of the play for its resolution, a resolution in which one of the girls will become a boy in order to please the other. In Jonson's play, all the important characters are male, and at the end, the revelation that the boy is a boy satisfies a man's desire for money, restores to the actor the sex he has off stage, and gratifies a status-hungry audience. In Shakespeare's transvestite comedies, the relation between sex and gender, and the relation between play world and audience world, like the relation between adult actors and their heterogeneous audience, remain dialectical, with neither reality obliterating the other. That neither we nor the characters know or care which of Lyly's girls will be transformed demonstrates the arbitrary quality of sexual difference in Galatea. Like the terms in a euphuistic paradox, sexual difference is endlessly reversible. In the artificial world of Lyly's fantasy, deceptive gender can become a model for true sex, costume for body, name for thing, disguise for reality. The result, however, is paradoxically similar to Jonson's, for although Lyly transforms a sexual disguise into truth to permit a marriage, and Jonson removes a sexual disguise to annul a marriage, both plays end in the abolition of sexual ambiguity. Jonson strips away Epicene's deceptive gender identity to reveal his true sex, rejecting artifice and grounding his resolution in nature. Lyly invokes the supernatural to dissolve that ground and celebrate the power of artifice. Jonson comes to rest in the masculine reality principle. Lyly contains it within the cosmic subplot. In the main plot, he wishes it away. But Lyly, no less than Jonson, resolves the marriage plot by rejecting the troublesome discrepancy between sex and gender embodied in the figure of the boy heroine. Shakespeare's transvestite comedies, unlike Lyly's and Jonson's, sustain that ambiguity to the end. Rejecting both Lyly's abolition of sexual difference and Jonson's denial of the inevitable gap that separates physical sex from social gender, Shakespeare marries his unlike lovers, joining male and female characters on his stage just as he joins masculine and feminine qualities in the androgynous figures of his boy heroines. Refusing to collapse the artistic representation into a simple replica of the world outside the theatre, or to abandon that world for a flight into escapist fantasy, he insists on the necessary ambivalence of his play as a kind of marriage, a mediation between opposites, which can be brought together only by the power of love and imagination. 5. That marriage, however, becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. It seems perfect at the end of As You Like It, when the saucy epilogue, like Jonson's saucy puppet lifting its garment in Bartholomew Fair, seems to dissolve in sophisticated laughter the problematic questions of gender and of the status of dramatic representations. In Twelfth Night, however, Shakespeare returns to those problems, and this time he insists on their seriousness. Viola, like Lyly's disguised girls, and unlike Portia and Rosalind, is unhappy in her transvestite disguise, and, almost as Rabbi Busy might do, she refers to her disguised self as a monster, and characterizes her disguise as a wickedness wherein the pregnant enemy does much. This is not to say that Shakespeare abandons fantasy in Twelfth Night. The entire play is set in the fantastic world of Illyria, where sanity looks like madness, and madness like sanity, and Viola's true sex is the opposite of that of the actor who played her part. Here, as in The Merchant of Venice, the truth in the play is an illusion from the point of view of the literal world, and the disguise in the play corresponds to the truth in the literal world. Here, however, as in As You Like It, the disguise is associated with the fantasy world within the play, and the scheme is complicated by the presence of Viola's twin brother Sebastian. He provides a kind of reality principle, and his presence, no less than Viola's, is necessary before the marriages that resolve the plot can take place. In assuming her masculine disguise, Viola imitates Sebastian's reality, just as art was said in Renaissance literary theory to imitate natural life. Olivia falls in love with the imitation, thus providing for a wonderfully complicated plot in which the disguised Viola adores Orsino, who is hopelessly in love with Olivia, who in turn dotes on Viola, whom she takes for the boy Cesario. Helpless in the face of this muddle, Viola comments, "Poor lady, she were better love a dream." And later, when she first suspects that her brother has miraculously appeared in Illyria, she prays, "Prove true, imagination, oh, prove true, that I, dear brother, be now ta'en for you." Finally, of course, the dream and the imagination do prove true when Sebastian materializes on stage to marry Olivia and untangle the love triangle. Thus, the conclusion of the play vindicates both the imagination that proves true and the truth that proves it. Without the illusion, Viola's disguise as a boy, the right characters would not have fallen in love. Without the reality, they could not have married. In the figure of Sebastian, gender and sex correspond, both within the play world and between the play world and the world of the audience. Twelfth Night incorporates the reality principle in its conclusion by splitting the unitary figure of the Androgyny into the marvelously identical boy-girl twins who were needed to make the resolution possible. At the end of the recognition scene, Orsino says to Viola Cesario, "Give me thy hand, and let me see thee in thy woman's weeds." A curious statement, which seems to make her marriage contingent on her change of costume. Orsino's demand serves to bring Malvolio back on stage for the attempted resolution of the gulling plot, for Viola is apparently unable to obtain a set of women's clothes without his intercession. Her women's clothes are being held by the captain who brought her ashore, a figure from the presumably real world outside Illyria. But he has been imprisoned on a lawsuit initiated by the puritanical, literal-minded Malvolio, the refuser of Illyrian madness and fantasy, who wants to marry Olivia for the same reasons Jonson's Dauphine does not want Montrose to marry anyone, out of concern for his own social and economic status. Without the cooperation of the reality principle that Malvolio and the captain represent, the boy actor cannot put on Viola's clothes, and the play ends on an equivocal note, with Malvolio stalking off the stage, crying, "I'll be revenged on the whole pack of you," and the clown singing a melancholy song that contrasts the ease and pleasing wish fulfillment of the festival world with conditions in the outside world, where the rain it raineth every day. As C.L. Barber remarks, in the 1640s, Malvolio was revenged on the whole pack of them, and even within Shakespeare's career, this is the last play where an androgynous heroine can put on her femininity with a theatrical costume. The Puritans closed the theatres, and a multitude of causes, which we are only beginning to understand, closed off many of the opportunities and possibilities that had been open to women at the beginning of the modern age. Changing portrayals of transvestite heroines on the Renaissance stage help to illuminate the early phase of the process, and they also give us a glimpse of a liminal moment when gender definitions were open to play. At the same time these plays were written, gender was still defined according to the old medieval associations of masculinity with spirit and femininity with body. But on the stage, the boy actress's body was male, while the character he portrayed was female. Thus inverting the off-stage associations, stage illusion radically subverted the gender divisions of the Elizabethan world. The increasingly masculinist thinking of the 17th and 18th centuries, expressed in forms as diverse as the persecution of witches, the suppression of women, and the rise of Baconian science, also expressed itself in new theories of mimesis that drew sharp distinctions between the reality of the world and the illusions of art, and betrayed a deepening anti-theatrical prejudice, even among writers for the stage. If, as the new historians of Renaissance literature are now arguing, the Elizabethan theatre was a creator as well as a creation of its culture, shaping the fantasies by which it was shaped, begetting that by which it was begotten, then it is perhaps worth remembering that the masculinist ideology that shaped the modern world established its hegemony in the same period when the theatres were closed.